You already know what it feels like. That moment, maybe it was a conversation, a signature on a document, a text message you sent at 11 p.m. and regretted by morning, where you understood with the kind of clarity that only arrives too late that you hadn't really thought it through. Not deeply, not honestly. You'd felt your way to a conclusion and then called it a decision. The feeling afterward isn't quite regret. It's something closer to estrangement, like meeting a version of yourself you didn't know was in charge. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people never sit with long enough to absorb. You have been thinking your entire life, and almost no one has ever taught you how. You were taught what to think, which answers to give, which beliefs to hold, which conclusions were acceptable. The process itself, the machinery underneath every judgment you make, was left to run on its own. Assembled from whatever your childhood handed you, your culture reinforced, and your emotions, in any given moment, found convenient. That machine is running right now. It ran when you chose your career. It ran when you ended or started that relationship. It's running as you listen to this. And mostly, not always, but mostly, it runs on shortcuts. This isn't a character flaw, it's architecture. The human brain didn't evolve to reason carefully. It evolved to survive quickly. Fast pattern recognition kept your ancestors alive. Slow, deliberate analysis would have gotten them eaten. The problem is that the world you're navigating now doesn't reward speed the way the savannah did. It rewards precision. It rewards the ability to look at a situation, strip away what you want to be true, and find what actually is. That capacity has a name, and it is learnable. What this audiobook is not. A collection of productivity hacks dressed in philosophical clothing. Not a list of biases to memorize so you can impress people at dinner. Not motivation. Motivation fades by Thursday. What it is, a systematic rebuild of the way you move from raw experience to conclusion. Drawn from 2,500 years of philosophy, decades of cognitive science, and the quiet discipline of people who learned to think their way out of situations that defeated smarter, more talented people around them. By the end, you won't just know more. You'll catch yourself mid-thought, in an argument, a meeting, a moment of fear, and you'll notice the machinery. And noticing it is the first and most important act of taking control of it. Let's begin. Before we go deeper, take a quick second to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I always find it amazing how people from different parts of the world connect through these messages. Chapter 1. The operating system you never chose. There's a study most people find mildly insulting when they first hear it. Researchers asked a large sample of people to rate their own reasoning ability relative to others. Roughly 85% placed themselves in the top half, which is, by definition, mathematically impossible. But here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. The people who scored lowest on the objective reasoning tests were the most confident in their self-assessments. Not slightly more confident, dramatically more. The gap between perceived ability and actual ability was largest in exactly the people who most needed to close it. David Dunning and Justin Kruger documented this in 1999. But what the popular summary of their work misses is the mechanism underneath. It's not simply that incompetent people are overconfident. It's that the same cognitive skills required to perform a task well are the skills required to recognize you're performing it badly. You can't see the flaw in your thinking with the same thinking that produced the flaw. The tool cannot audit itself. This is where most books about critical thinking start in the wrong place. They hand you a list of logical fallacies and tell you to watch out for them, as if awareness alone were sufficient. But the problem runs deeper than awareness. It's structural. It lives in the operating system you've been running since before you could articulate a complete sentence. Think about what actually built your mental software, not what you'd like to say built it, your education, your values, your considered experience, but what actually did. The emotional atmosphere of the household you grew up in, the social rules of the peer groups that accepted or rejected you, the stories your culture told about who deserves success, what constitutes failure, which emotions are safe to show, and which must be managed in private. None of this arrived with a label. None of it said this is a belief, not a fact. It arrived as reality, as the way things simply are. Psychologists call these structures schemas, cognitive frameworks that organize incoming information before conscious thought even engages. They're not beliefs you hold. They're the lens through which beliefs become possible. And because they operate beneath awareness, they feel less like assumptions and more like perception itself. Here's where Kahneman's work becomes essential rather than just interesting. His research describes two modes of thinking. System 1, which is fast, automatic, associative, and largely unconscious, and System 2, which is slow, deliberate, effortful, and conscious. System 1 runs almost constantly. System 2 is expensive. The brain, treating energy conservation as a survival priority, defaults to System 1 whenever it can get away with it. And it can get away with it far more often than you'd like to believe. What this means practically is that the vast majority of your daily judgments, including judgments that feel considered, that feel careful, that feel like the product of genuine reflection, are actually System 1 outputs that System 2 has been recruited to justify after the fact. You feel a conclusion first. Then you think your way to reasons. And those reasons feel like causes when they are actually, almost always, effects. Jonathan Haidt called this the rider and the elephant. System 1 is the elephant, enormous, powerful, moving by instinct. System 2 is the rider, smaller, slower, believing it's in control, but mostly just holding on and narrating the journey as if it had chosen the direction. The insight that most discussions of this research skip over is this. The rider is not the enemy of good thinking. The rider is the only instrument you have for examining the elephant's behavior. The goal is not to suppress System 1. It contains genuine wisdom, pattern recognition built from real experience, information your conscious mind cannot fully access. The goal is to build a System 2 that is practiced enough, disciplined enough, and honest enough to know when System 1 should be trusted and when it should be questioned. That distinction, knowing when to trust your gut rather than simply learning to distrust it, is one of the most underappreciated skills in the entire field of cognitive science. Gary Klein spent decades studying expert decision-makers, firefighters, military commanders, chess grandmasters. His finding was not that experts suppress intuition. It's that expert intuition is qualitatively different from novice intuition. It's built from thousands of hours of feedback-rich experience, where wrong patterns were corrected in real time. The firefighter who walks into a burning building and feels something is wrong before he can articulate why isn't guessing. He's processing a complex pattern that his conscious mind hasn't caught up to yet. But, and this is the part that matters, that same firefighter, placed in an unfamiliar type of fire in conditions outside his experience base, becomes dangerous if he trusts the same gut feeling. Because now the pattern recognition system is generating outputs from incomplete data, and he has no conscious mechanism to flag the difference. This is your situation in almost every high-stakes domain of your life. You have genuine expertise in some areas, accumulated carefully over years of real feedback. And you have borrowed confidence in many others, the feeling of knowing, without the experience base that would justify it. The first discipline of critical thinking is not skepticism toward the world. It's a very specific, very honest form of inventory taking directed inward. What do I actually know here, as opposed to what do I feel I know? Where has my thinking been tested against reality, and where has it simply never been contradicted? Start there, not with techniques, not with frameworks. With the discomfort of that question, because the operating system you never chose is running right now. The work is not to replace it. The work is to finally read the code. Chapter 2. What critical thinking actually is. Most people, if you ask them whether they think critically, will say yes. Then they'll describe something that sounds like being skeptical of things they already disagreed with. That's not critical thinking. That's confirmation bias with better posture. The word critical comes from the Greek kritikos, the capacity to discern, to judge, to make distinctions. Not to tear down, not to doubt everything reflexively. To discern, which is a far more demanding and far more specific activity than mere skepticism. Skepticism says, I'm not sure that's true. Critical thinking asks, what would it take to know whether it's true? And am I willing to do that work even if the answer is inconvenient? That second half is where almost everyone quietly exits. Here is a definition precise enough to be useful. Critical thinking is the disciplined practice of evaluating information, arguments, and assumptions against explicit standards of logic, evidence, and coherent reasoning, with the explicit intention of forming better judgments rather than confirming existing ones. Every word in that definition is load-bearing. Disciplined means it doesn't happen by accident. Explicit standards means the criteria are stated before the evaluation, not invented afterward to fit the conclusion. And better judgments, not comfortable ones, not socially acceptable ones, better ones. What makes this harder than it sounds is that human cognition was not designed for it. We are, at the neurological level, meaning-making machines. The brain abhors ambiguity the way a vacuum abhors air. Given incomplete information, which is always, it fills the gaps automatically, fluently, and without flagging the fill. The result feels like understanding. It feels like having thought something through. But what has actually happened is a story has been constructed, not a truth discovered. This is where the Stoics were, I think, more practically useful than they are usually given credit for. Epictetus, a former slave who became one of the most influential philosophers of the ancient world, built his entire system around a single distinction, the difference between what is up to us and what is not. But underneath that famous formulation was a more precise psychological observation. He called it the discipline of fantasia, the impression. Every experience, every piece of information, every event arrives first as an impression, a raw signal. Before you have consciously processed it, before you have decided anything, the impression has already been interpreted by your existing beliefs, your emotional state, your history. What you experience as reality is always, in the first instance, an impression of reality, already filtered, already colored, already partly constructed. Epictetus's prescription was radical for its time and remains radical now. Before you act on an impression, examine it. Hold it at arm's length. Ask whether it accurately represents what is actually there, or whether it represents what your existing framework expected to find. He called this prososche, attention. Continuous disciplined attention to your own interpretive process. This is not a passive or gentle practice. Epictetus was unsparing about how rarely people do it, and how much of human suffering he believed resulted from acting on unexamined impressions as if they were facts. Most arguments, he suggested, are not disagreements about reality. They are collisions between two people's unexamined impressions of reality, each of whom is certain they are simply describing what is there. What cognitive science has added to Epictetus's framework is the mechanism. We now know that the brain's predictive processing system generates expectations before sensory data arrives. You are not passively receiving the world and then interpreting it. You are actively predicting the world and then checking whether incoming data matches the prediction. When it does, confirmation, smooth processing, the feeling of understanding. When it doesn't, surprise, discomfort, and a quick internal negotiation about whether to update the prediction or discount the data. The critical thinking failure mode is not stupidity. It is the entirely normal, entirely human tendency to discount contradictory data rather than update the prediction, because updating is expensive. It requires revising not just one belief, but often a network of connected beliefs, a whole structure of self-understanding that was built, piece by piece, over years. This means that genuine critical thinking is, at its foundation, an act of courage before it is an act of intelligence. It requires being willing to find out you were wrong about something you were certain about. Not occasionally, regularly, as a practice. And here is something the source scripts and frameworks and six-step models almost never say plainly. The people who are most publicly committed to critical thinking are often among the worst at applying it to themselves. Because the public performance of rigor, the careful citations, the logical frameworks, the visible skepticism toward others' claims can become its own kind of armor against genuine self-examination. I've seen this, watched very smart people dismantle someone else's argument with surgical precision and then make a major life decision on pure emotional reaction and call it instinct. Intelligence without the specific discipline of self-directed examination is not an advantage in critical thinking. It is often a liability. Smarter people construct more sophisticated rationalizations. They are better at finding reasons for what they already believe. The machinery runs faster, not cleaner. So what is critical thinking actually? It is the practice, imperfect, uncomfortable, ongoing, of catching your own mind in the act of constructing a story and asking whether the story is true. Not whether it feels true, not whether it's useful or comforting or socially appropriate, whether it is actually verifiably, honestly true. That question, asked with genuine willingness to hear the answer, is where everything else in this audiobook begins. Chapter 3. The Socratic Wound. Here is a fact about Socrates that the philosophy textbooks mention but rarely dwell on. He was killed for it, not metaphorically. The citizens of Athens, a democracy, a civilization we still cite as the birthplace of rational thought, voted 280 to 220 to execute a 70-year-old man whose primary activity was asking uncomfortable questions in public spaces. They charged him with corrupting the youth and impiety. What they meant was that he made powerful people feel stupid, and powerful people across all of recorded history have found that unforgivable. This matters for reasons beyond historical interest. It tells you something true about what genuine questioning costs and why most people, including people who consider themselves open-minded, intellectually honest, committed to truth, quietly stop short of it when the stakes become personal. Socrates didn't argue. He asked. That was the method's genius and its social danger. He would approach someone publicly recognized as wise, a politician, a poet, a military general, and with apparent humility request their help understanding something he found confusing. The questions were simple, almost childlike. What is courage? What is justice? What makes an action good? And the person, flattered, confident, would begin to answer. And Socrates would ask a follow-up question about that answer. And then another. And within 20 minutes, the expert would be visibly confused about something they had been certain of when the conversation began. The Socratic method is not a debate technique. It is a diagnostic tool for locating the exact depth at which genuine understanding ends and comfortable assumption begins. In almost every case, that depth is shallower than the person expected. But here is what the standard account of Socratic questioning consistently omits: why it works psychologically and why it so often fails socially. Daniel Kahan at Yale has spent years researching what he calls identity protective cognition, the phenomenon whereby people evaluate evidence not on its merits, but on whether accepting it would threaten their sense of belonging to a group they value. The more educated and intelligent the person, the more efficiently they deploy this mechanism. They don't reject threatening information because they're incapable of processing it. They reject it because accepting it would cost them something: a professional identity, a tribal affiliation, a self-image they've invested years constructing. What this means for the practice of questioning is profound and largely unacknowledged. If you ask a question that makes someone feel their intelligence or identity is under attack, they will not think more clearly in response. They will think more defensively. The System 1 threat response activates, and System 2, the very faculty you were hoping to engage, gets recruited to defend rather than examine. You haven't opened a mind. You've closed it harder than it was before. Socrates knew this risk and accepted the consequences. Most of us, reasonably, prefer not to be executed. So the practical discipline of Socratic questioning requires a modification that Socrates himself didn't need to make because he was famously indifferent to social comfort. You must learn to direct the questions inward before directing them outward. The most powerful application of the Socratic method is not on other people. It is on your own thinking. Before any important conversation, decision, or judgment, the practice is to ask yourself the questions Socrates would have asked you. What exactly do I mean when I say this? What am I assuming is true that I haven't verified? What would I need to believe for my conclusion to follow? And, the hardest one, what evidence would change my mind, and why haven't I looked for it? That last question is the one most people skip, because the answer, if you're honest, is often that you haven't looked for contradictory evidence because you didn't want to find it. And that is not a character flaw. It is the default setting of a mind doing exactly what evolution designed it to do. But it is a setting that, in the modern world, produces reliably poor outcomes in proportion to the stakes of the decision. There is a specific questioning sequence worth building into any significant decision process. It moves through 5 layers. First, what is my actual claim here, stripped of emotional language and social framing, stated as plainly as possible? Second, what am I assuming in order for that claim to make sense? And have I examined those assumptions or merely inherited them? Third, what evidence supports this claim, and how strong is that evidence? Is it systematic or anecdotal, recent or outdated, from a source with incentives that might color the conclusion? Fourth, what evidence contradicts this claim, and what is my honest response to it? Have I genuinely engaged with the strongest version of the opposing case, or a weakened version I find easier to dismiss? Fifth, if I am wrong, what would that mean? For my decision, for my self-understanding, for the people affected by my choices? Most thinking stops at the first layer. Some reaches the second. Very few, without deliberate practice, consistently reach the fourth and fifth. Here is the thing about the fourth layer specifically. Philosophers have a name for it: steel manning, the opposite of straw manning. Instead of constructing the weakest possible version of an opposing argument in order to defeat it easily, you construct the strongest possible version. You make the case against your own position as powerfully as you can, and then you ask whether your position survives that. This is genuinely uncomfortable. It should be. If it isn't uncomfortable, you're probably not doing it honestly. The discomfort is the sensation of a real idea pressing against the limits of your current thinking, and that pressure, not the resolution of it, but the pressure itself, is where intellectual growth actually happens. The Socratic wound is this. Once you learn to question at this depth, you cannot unknow how shallow most public discourse, most professional advice, most confident assertions actually are. You start hearing the assumptions beneath the arguments. You notice when evidence is being cited selectively. You feel the exact moment a conversation stops being an inquiry and becomes a performance. It makes you in certain company difficult. It makes you in the right company invaluable. Socrates chose difficult. The jury made him pay for it. You get to decide in each specific situation which version of that trade-off you're willing to make. But the questioning itself, directed honestly at your own mind first, costs nothing except the comfort of being certain. And certainty, as a practice, is far more expensive than it appears. Chapter 4. The Architecture of an Argument. Most disagreements are not about facts. Spend enough time in any serious conflict, a business decision, a relationship rupture, a political debate, and you'll notice that both sides usually have access to roughly the same information. What they don't share is the invisible structure underneath their conclusions, the framework that connects evidence to claim. And because that framework is invisible, because neither side has made it explicit, the argument circles endlessly. More data gets added. Voices get louder. Nothing resolves. Because the actual disagreement, the disagreement about the reasoning structure itself, was never located. Stephen Toulmin, a British philosopher working in the 1950s, built a model of argument anatomy that remains one of the most practically useful thinking tools ever developed, and one of the least taught outside specialized academic circles. He identified 6 components in any complete argument. The claim, what you're asserting. The grounds, the evidence or facts you're citing. The warrant, the logical principle that connects your grounds to your claim. The backing, the support for the warrant itself. The qualifier, the degree of certainty you're claiming. And the rebuttal, the conditions under which your claim would not hold. Most arguments in daily life consist of a claim and some grounds. Everything else is left implicit. And the warrant, the connective tissue between evidence and conclusion, is almost never examined, which means that 2 people can look at identical evidence and reach opposite conclusions without either of them being illogical because they are operating from different warrants, different unstated principles about how the world works, about what causes what, about what evidence means. Consider something simple. 2 colleagues look at declining sales figures. One concludes, we need to increase our marketing spend. The other concludes, we need to reduce our product line and focus. Same grounds, opposite claims. The disagreement is not about the data. It's about the warrant, the unstated belief each person holds about what causes sales to decline and what fixes it. Until those warrants are surfaced and examined, the argument cannot be resolved. It can only be won by whoever has more authority in the room, which is a terrible way to arrive at true conclusions. Here is the practice. When you find yourself in a disagreement that isn't resolving, stop arguing about the evidence and ask instead, what principle are you applying that takes you from this evidence to that conclusion? State your own warrant explicitly. Ask the other person to state theirs. The conversation almost always changes the moment this happens. Sometimes the warrants themselves are the real disagreement. Sometimes, once stated, one party recognizes that their warrant was an assumption they'd never examined. This is the Toulmin insight that the source model doesn't explicitly name. Most intellectual conflict is warrant-level conflict mistakenly fought at the evidence level. You keep handing each other data when what you need to exchange is the reasoning framework that gives data its meaning. Aristotle's 3 modes of persuasion Logos, ethos, pathos are typically taught as techniques for influencing others. Use logic, credibility, and emotion to make your case more compelling. That framing turns Aristotle into a manipulation manual. But reframe them as diagnostic categories, directed inward, and they become something far more useful, a tool for identifying where your own argument is weakest. Logos, the logical structure. Does your claim actually follow from your evidence? Stated formally, if your grounds are true and your warrant is valid, does your conclusion necessarily follow? Most people assume it does. Checking it explicitly, using even the roughest form of syllogistic reasoning Aristotle formalized, reveals gaps that intuition smoothly papers over. Ethos, the credibility component. Here, directed inward, the question becomes, am I claiming more authority on this subject than my actual experience justifies? There is a particular intellectual failure mode where genuine expertise in one domain produces false confidence in adjacent domains. The accomplished scientist who speaks with equal certainty about economics. The successful entrepreneur whose business acumen convinces them they understand geopolitics. Expertise does not transfer. The warrant that justified confidence in one domain is not automatically valid in another. Pathos, the emotional dimension. The inward diagnostic question here is uncomfortable. Am I drawn to this conclusion because the evidence supports it, or because it feels good to believe? Because it fits a narrative that makes me the protagonist? Because it justifies a decision I've already emotionally committed to? This is not a rhetorical question. It requires honest self-examination, and the answer, more often than most people want to admit, is that emotion arrived first and evidence was gathered afterward. There is a cognitive phenomenon psychologists call belief perseverance, the tendency for beliefs to survive even after the evidence that originally supported them has been completely undermined. In a landmark study, researchers gave participants evidence supporting one of two positions on a contested topic. Then they told participants the evidence was fabricated. The participants' beliefs, measured after the retraction, had barely moved. The belief had formed and then decoupled from the evidence that formed it. It was now self-sustaining. This is not an anomaly. It is the normal behavior of a belief once it has been integrated into a person's self-understanding. And it explains why presenting better evidence to a person with an entrenched position rarely changes the position. The argument was never really about the evidence. What does change entrenched beliefs, and this is well documented, is a process closer to the Socratic method than the debate format. Questions rather than counter-arguments. Curiosity rather than correction. The goal of understanding the warrant, not defeating the claim. When people feel that their reasoning is being genuinely examined rather than their identity being attacked, the defensive response softens. System 2 re-engages. Real thinking becomes possible again. There is one more component of argument architecture that deserves direct attention: the difference between a conclusion and a rationalization. They can look identical from the outside. Both are stated as reasoned positions with evidence attached. The difference is in the direction of travel. A conclusion begins with evidence and arrives at a position. A rationalization begins with a position and works backward to find evidence. The logical structure appears the same. The epistemic integrity is completely different. Developing the ability to catch yourself rationalizing in real time while you're doing it is one of the most demanding skills in this entire discipline. Because rationalization feels, from the inside, exactly like reasoning. The tell, usually, is a faint awareness that you are not genuinely open to being wrong, that you are building a case rather than conducting an inquiry. When you notice that feeling, stop. Back up. Ask what conclusion you would reach if you genuinely didn't know the answer yet. Then see if the evidence takes you somewhere different. Chapter 5. Evidence and the Lie. We call intuition. There is a particular kind of confidence that should frighten you more than uncertainty does. It arrives without effort. It feels like clarity. It speaks in the first person without hesitation and doesn't wait for permission. You know it as the sensation of being sure, that immediate, full-bodied sense that something is true, that a person is trustworthy, that a decision is right, that an explanation is correct. It arrives faster than reasoning can. It feels more honest than analysis. And in a significant percentage of cases, it is wrong in ways that careful examination would have caught. This is not an argument against intuition. It is an argument for knowing what intuition actually is. Thomas Gilovich spent decades at Cornell studying how people form and maintain beliefs in the face of evidence. His central finding was not that people are irrational. It was that people are selectively rational. When evidence supports something they want to believe, the question they ask is, "Can I believe this?" The bar is low. One confirming data point often suffices. When evidence challenges something they want to believe, the question shifts to, "Must I believe this?" The bar becomes nearly insurmountable. They look for flaws in the methodology. They question the source. They recall a contradictory anecdote. They do not apply the same scrutiny in both directions, and they are not aware that they are doing this. This asymmetry, rigorous toward unwelcome evidence, permissive toward welcome evidence, is what Gilovich called motivated reasoning. And what makes it so resistant to correction is that it is largely invisible to the person performing it. The evaluation genuinely feels objective. The skepticism toward threatening evidence feels like careful thinking. The acceptance of confirming evidence feels like recognizing the obvious. The bias does not announce itself. It disguises itself as discernment. The psychological immune system is the name some researchers use for this mechanism, and the metaphor is precise. Just as the body's immune system deploys defenses against foreign threats, sometimes aggressively, sometimes mistakenly attacking things that weren't actually dangerous, the mind deploys defensive cognition against threatening information. And just as physical immunity can become autoimmune disease, mental immunity can become the systematic rejection of genuine truth. What is your psychological immune system currently protecting? That's not a rhetorical question. It has a specific answer, and the answer is usually visible in the places where you notice yourself becoming disproportionately irritated by certain arguments, dismissive of certain sources, or unusually eager to find flaws in certain types of evidence. The heat of the response is often proportional to the threat the evidence poses to something you've organized your self-understanding around. Evidence examined carefully and honestly has specific characteristics worth knowing. Strong evidence is systematic rather than anecdotal. It comes from conditions designed to minimize the influence of the observer's expectations and to maximize the representativeness of the sample. It is replicable. Other researchers using similar methods have found similar results. It is specific. It measures what it claims to measure, not a proxy that might be influenced by unrelated factors. And it is falsifiable. It was obtained through a process where a different result was genuinely possible, not a process designed to confirm a predetermined conclusion. Anecdotal evidence fails on almost all of these criteria, and yet it is the category of evidence that most powerfully shapes human belief. Your friend who swears by a supplement. The story you heard about someone who made a fortune in a specific investment. The one time you trusted your instinct and it worked out perfectly. These stories carry enormous psychological weight precisely because they are concrete, personal, and emotionally vivid. The mind evolved to learn from stories. Stories were the original data format. But a story, however vivid, is a sample size of one. and a sample size of 1 drawn from a self-selected and often emotionally charged situation tells you almost nothing reliable about what will happen in a different situation to a different person under different conditions. The distinction between feeling certain and being correct deserves more direct examination than it usually receives. Certainty is a psychological state. It is the subjective experience of confidence, the absence of internal doubt, the sense that something is simply obvious. It correlates with truth in conditions where your pattern recognition system has been trained on reliable feedback over many repetitions in a stable environment. It correlates poorly with truth in novel situations, high-stakes decisions with infrequent feedback cycles, and domains where the available information is systematically skewed by selection bias or motivated reporting, which describes most of the important decisions in your life. The high-stakes certainty warning is this: the domains where you feel most certain are often the domains where you have the least systematic feedback and the most emotional investment. Career choices, relationship decisions, financial strategies, beliefs about your own capabilities and limitations. These are exactly the areas where the feeling of certainty is least trustworthy and most consequential. There is a practice, borrowed loosely from scientific methodology, that cuts through motivated reasoning more reliably than any other single technique. Before you evaluate a piece of evidence, state explicitly what conclusion it would support if it turned out to be valid. Then evaluate it. Then ask whether you applied the same standards you would have applied if it had been pointing in the opposite direction. This pre-commitment to an evaluation standard, established before you know the result, removes the possibility of shifting the goalposts based on where the ball lands. Judges who are told a defendant's race before reviewing case evidence reach different verdicts than judges who review the same evidence without that information. Doctors who are told a patient's diagnosis before examining symptoms find more confirming evidence than doctors who examine symptoms first. Investors who have already committed emotionally to a position find more supporting analysis than investors evaluating the same data without prior commitment. The evidence does not change. The evaluation of it does. And the evaluator, in each case, genuinely believes they are being objective. This is not about being fooled by obvious manipulation. It is about the mundane, constant, invisible influence of prior commitment on subsequent evaluation. The fix is not to become more skeptical of all evidence equally. That produces paralysis, not clarity. The fix is to become specifically, deliberately, uncomfortable with evidence that confirms what you already believe. To apply your most rigorous scrutiny precisely where your instinct is, to relax it. And when your intuition speaks loudly, clearly, and without doubt, especially in a domain where you haven't been systematically trained, where feedback has been rare or delayed, where the stakes are high, and the decision is irreversible, that confidence is not a signal of truth. It is a signal to slow down. Chapter 6. The Art of Building Your Own Argument. Nobody teaches you how to construct a position. Not really? School teaches you to support a thesis, which sounds similar but is fundamentally different. Supporting a thesis means you start with the conclusion and work backward, selecting evidence that fits. Constructing a position means you start with evidence and follow it forward, even when it takes you somewhere you didn't expect. The first is an exercise in advocacy. The second is an exercise in inquiry. Most people spend their lives doing the first while believing they're doing the second. The difference matters enormously, not just for intellectual honesty, but for practical outcomes. An argument built backward from a conclusion has a hidden structural weakness. It is only as strong as your original instinct. If the instinct was wrong, shaped by bias, incomplete information, emotional need, the argument will be wrong too, regardless of how skillfully it's assembled. An argument built forward from evidence can correct a bad instinct. It can take you somewhere your gut wouldn't have gone. That's not a bug. That's the entire point. Aristotle's three modes of persuasion, logos, ethos, pathos, are almost always taught as tools for influencing other people. But there is a more important application. Use them as a diagnostic against your own positions. Before you present an argument to anyone else, subject it to all three from the inside. Logos first. Does the logical structure hold? Strip the argument down to its skeleton. If the evidence I'm citing is accurate, and if the principle connecting that evidence to my conclusion is valid, does the conclusion actually follow? Or have I made a jump that feels natural, but isn't logically necessary? Logical necessity is strict. This approach has worked in similar companies, does not logically entail this approach will work here. The jump from the general to the specific requires examining what is actually similar, what is different, and whether the differences matter. Most arguments, when stripped this way, reveal at least one jump that was assumed rather than demonstrated. Ethos next. What is the actual basis of my authority to make this claim? Not the social or professional authority. That's irrelevant to whether the claim is true. The epistemic authority. Have I had enough direct feedback-rich experience in this domain to trust my pattern recognition here? Have I studied the relevant evidence systematically, or have I absorbed a general impression from exposure? These are not comfortable questions when the answer is that your confidence exceeds your actual knowledge base. But they are necessary ones, because an argument that overreaches its epistemic foundation will eventually collapse, and it's far better to find the weakness yourself than to have someone else locate it under high-stakes conditions. Pathos last. And this is the one that requires the most honesty. What emotional need is this argument serving? Not whether you have an emotional investment in the outcome, which is almost always true and not disqualifying in itself, but whether the emotional investment has shaped the selection and interpretation of evidence. The tell is a specific feeling, the feeling of wanting the argument to be airtight rather than wanting it to be true. When you find yourself hunting for supporting evidence rather than genuinely evaluating all available evidence, when you feel a flicker of relief at a confirming data point and a flicker of resistance at a contradicting one, that asymmetry is pathos contaminating logos. Name it. Adjust for it. There is a phenomenon called belief perseverance that makes building honest arguments harder than it should be. Once a belief forms, even provisionally, it begins to shape subsequent information processing in its own favor. Evidence consistent with it is processed fluently and retained. Evidence inconsistent with it is processed with friction and often not retained at all. The belief becomes, in a real sense, self-reinforcing, not because reality is confirming it, but because perception has been tuned to find confirmation. The practical defense against belief perseverance is pre-commitment to explicit criteria. Before you begin evaluating evidence on a question, write down, or state clearly to yourself, what kinds of evidence would change your mind, and in what direction. What would you need to see to conclude the opposite of what you currently expect? This is not a thought experiment. It is a cognitive anchor that partially counteracts the drift toward selective processing. When you encounter evidence later, you can ask, is this the kind of thing I said would be decisive? If yes, and you're still resisting it, that resistance needs to be examined rather than acted on. Building a strong argument also requires a skill that is genuinely rare, the ability to construct the best possible case against your own position before anyone else does. Philosophers call it steel manning, the opposite of straw manning. A straw man is a weakened, distorted version of an opposing argument built to be easily defeated. A steelman is the strongest, most charitable, most sophisticated version of the opposing argument, built honestly, without sabotage. The reason this is rare is that it requires you to temporarily inhabit a viewpoint you disagree with and argue for it as effectively as you can. This is uncomfortable in a very specific way. It's not the discomfort of encountering a strong opposing argument from someone else. That can be defended against. It's the discomfort of discovering, through your own rigorous effort, that the opposing argument is stronger than you wanted it to be. That your position has vulnerabilities you hadn't acknowledged. But here is what steelmanning reveals that nothing else does. It shows you exactly where your argument needs to be reinforced, and it shows you whether the reinforcement is possible. Sometimes you steelman the opposition and realize your position survives comfortably. You've identified the weaknesses and can address them. Sometimes you steelman the opposition and realize your position doesn't survive, that your original conviction was built on grounds that don't hold under the strongest challenge. That second outcome feels like failure. It is actually the most valuable result a thinking process can produce. An argument worth making can survive steelmanning. If it can't, it shouldn't be made, not because certainty is required, but because intellectual honesty is. You can hold a position tentatively with acknowledged uncertainty that a steelman reveals as defensible but contested. What you can't honestly do is hold a position with high confidence that a steelman reveals as structurally weak and continue asserting it as if the challenge doesn't exist. There is one final component of argument construction that is almost never discussed in frameworks or models: the close. Not the conclusion of the argument, the emotional and intellectual note on which it lands. The best arguments don't end by restating the claim. They end by opening something, a question the evidence makes newly urgent, a consequence that only becomes visible once the argument is complete, an invitation to examine something the listener now has better tools to examine. An argument that closes by demanding agreement is an argument that doesn't trust itself. An argument that closes by creating genuine curiosity about what is true, that argument has done something more valuable than winning. It has made thinking feel worth doing. Chapter 7. The Gaps. Where smart people go wrong. There is a finding in cognitive science that should permanently change how you think about the relationship between intelligence and good reasoning. Keith Stanovich at the University of Toronto spent years developing what he called the rationality quotient, a measure of thinking quality distinct from IQ. His finding was not that smart people reason better. It was that smart people reason differently, and not always in the direction you'd hope. High IQ predicts the ability to solve well-defined problems with clear criteria and sufficient information. It does not predict the ability to recognize when a problem is poorly defined, when information is insufficient, or when your own reasoning has gone off the rails. Worse, Stanovich found that higher cognitive ability is associated with stronger my-side bias, the tendency to evaluate evidence based on whether it supports your existing position. Smart people don't have less of this bias. They have more sophisticated machinery for enacting it. They construct more elaborate justifications. They identify more obscure flaws in opposing evidence. They are, in short, better at being wrong in ways that are difficult to detect and harder to correct. This is the gap that matters most, and it sits at the center of most serious reasoning failures. Not the absence of intelligence, but the misapplication of it. The brain is a tool that can be used for inquiry or for advocacy, and without deliberate discipline, it defaults to advocacy, defending the position already held, protecting the identity already constructed, maintaining the narrative already underway. The logical fallacies that fill introductory critical thinking courses, the ad hominem, the false dichotomy, the slippery slope, are real and worth knowing. But they are the obvious failures, the ones visible from a distance. The reasoning errors that actually cost people the most are subtler. They are the errors that feel like careful thinking while they are happening. False cause is among the most pervasive. The brain is a pattern detection machine, and pattern detection is so automatic, so rapid, and so deeply rewarding neurologically that it runs constantly, generating causal narratives from correlational data without flagging the distinction. Two things happen together repeatedly, and the mind doesn't conclude merely that they co-occur. It concludes that one produces the other. And then it looks for confirming instances, finds them readily because they are genuinely there, and the causal belief solidifies into apparent fact. The historical record of medicine is largely a chronicle of false cause, treatments that correlated with recovery in conditions where most patients would have recovered anyway, interpreted as causes of recovery practiced for decades before controlled conditions could distinguish the treatment effect from the natural course of the disease. The lesson is not that medicine was stupid. It is that false cause is invisible without a specific, deliberate methodological commitment to asking, what else could explain this pattern? Cherry-picking evidence is rarely conscious. That is what makes it so dangerous. In most cases, the person selecting favorable evidence genuinely believes they are being thorough. They have looked at the evidence. They have considered it carefully. What they have not done is systematically seek out the evidence they didn't find, the studies that didn't confirm the hypothesis, the cases where the pattern didn't hold, the data that existed but wasn't included in the sources they consulted. The absence of contradicting evidence feels like confirmation. It is often just absence of search. The correction requires an active commitment that runs against the natural direction of inquiry. When building a case for any position, deliberately seek disconfirmation. Search specifically for credible evidence that contradicts your conclusion. Not to use it, to know it exists, understand its force, and either genuinely address it or revise your conclusion in response to it. If you cannot find strong contradicting evidence after an honest search, that is meaningful. If you find it and address it, your argument is stronger for having done so. If you find it and ignore it, you have moved from reasoning into advocacy, whatever it feels like from the inside. Emotional manipulation disguised as logic deserves particular attention because it is increasingly the dominant mode of public argument. The structure looks logical: premises, evidence, conclusion. But the evidence is selected and framed to produce an emotional response that carries the listener past logical evaluation to a predetermined conclusion. The tell is disproportionality. The emotional weight of the presentation significantly exceeds what the evidence would justify on purely logical grounds. Fear is the most commonly deployed emotion because the threat response bypasses System 2 almost completely. An argument that makes you frightened is an argument you should examine with triple the usual rigor, not accept with reduced scrutiny, because the stakes feel high. Oversimplification is the error of applying a solution whose complexity is mismatched to the problem it claims to address. Complex systems, organizations, economies, relationships, bodies have properties that simple interventions cannot reliably predict or control. They exhibit feedback loops, emergent behaviors, nonlinear responses to linear inputs. The history of policy failures, business strategy disasters, and personal development plans that produce the opposite of their intended effect is largely a history of oversimplified models applied to complex systems. The correction here is not to insist on complete complexity before any action. Paralysis is its own failure mode. It is to hold your simplified model with explicit awareness that it is a simplification, to identify the assumptions it requires, and to build monitoring systems that can detect when reality is behaving in ways your model didn't predict. The model is a tool, not a map. When the territory diverges from the map, update the map. Unexamined assumptions are the deepest and most consequential category of reasoning gap because they are invisible by definition. An assumption you are aware of is no longer fully an assumption. You can examine it, test it, decide to hold it provisionally. The assumptions that do the most damage are the ones so thoroughly integrated into your thinking that they feel like features of reality rather than beliefs about it. The discipline of surfacing unexamined assumptions requires a specific kind of effort. Periodically asking about your most confident positions, what would have to be true for this to be wrong? Not what evidence contradicts it. You might have already addressed that. But what assumption, if false, would undermine the entire framework? What are you taking so completely for granted that you haven't thought to question it? Here is the private admission that comes with having spent time seriously examining this. The assumptions I have found most resistant to examination are not the minor ones. They are the ones about what I am capable of, what kind of person I am, and what I deserve, the self-narrative that everything else is organized around. Those assumptions feel the most like reality and are the least frequently tested against it, which means that the deepest application of gap detection is not to other people's arguments. It is to the story you are telling yourself about yourself, examined with the same rigor, the same willingness to find contradicting evidence, the same refusal to let emotional investment substitute for logical validity, that you would apply to any other claim you are taking seriously. That application is harder than any logical fallacy to identify and correct, but it is where the real leverage is. Chapter 8. 2 systems, 1 mind picture. The last time you made a decision under genuine pressure, not the medium pressure of a busy workday, but the real kind, a confrontation you didn't expect, a deadline that arrived without warning, a conversation that turned suddenly into something higher stakes than it started. Try to remember what your thinking felt like in that moment, whether it felt like thinking at all or whether it felt more like being carried, responses arriving before you'd consciously chosen them, words coming out of your mouth that your reflective self observed with a slight delay, as if watching someone else handle the situation. That gap between the response and the reflection is the space where 2 systems live, and understanding how they interact is not academic. It is the difference between being someone who thinks well under pressure and someone who thinks well only when nothing is at stake. Kahneman's System 1 and System 2 distinction is now widely known, which means it is also widely misunderstood. The common misreading treats System 1 as the villain, the emotional, impulsive, bias-prone reactor that critical thinking must suppress, and System 2 as the hero, the rational, deliberate, accurate analyzer that good thinking should maximize. This framing is wrong in ways that matter practically. System 1 is not your enemy. It is the repository of everything you have ever learned well enough that it became automatic. Every skill you've genuinely mastered lives in System 1. The experienced surgeon who notices something wrong before she can articulate what. The seasoned negotiator who reads the room in 30 seconds. The musician who plays a complex passage without conscious attention to individual notes, which frees conscious attention for interpretation and expression. System 1 is not the absence of intelligence. It is intelligence made efficient through practice. System 2 is not the hero. It is expensive, slow, easily depleted, and, critically, lazy in ways that are not obvious. System 2 does not automatically activate when it should. It activates when System 1 flags uncertainty or when the problem is explicitly framed as requiring analysis. In most everyday situations, System 1 handles the processing, and System 2 endorses the output without genuine examination. This is not a malfunction. It is energy management. The brain cannot afford full System 2 engagement on the thousands of micro-decisions that constitute a day. But it means that System 2's endorsement is not the same as System 2's analysis. And the difference matters enormously for high-stakes judgments. What neuroscience has added to Kahneman's psychological framework is the mechanism of prefrontal override, the brain's ability to modulate automatic responses through deliberate executive function. The prefrontal cortex, particularly the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, is the neural substrate of what we experience as deliberate reasoning. It can slow the response generated by faster, more automatic systems. It can hold competing possibilities in mind simultaneously. It can inhibit the first answer and search for a better one. But here is what the neuroscience makes unavoidably clear. This capacity is physiologically degraded by stress, fatigue, sleep deprivation, and emotional arousal. Not metaphorically degraded, structurally impaired. Under acute stress, cortisol and adrenaline shift blood flow and neural priority toward the amygdala, the threat detection system, and away from the prefrontal cortex. The very capacity you most need for careful reasoning is the capacity that becomes least available precisely when the stakes are highest and the pressure is greatest. This is not a personal failing, it is anatomy. But it means that the people who think clearly under pressure are not people who have stronger willpower or better intentions in the moment. They are people who have done enough preparation outside the moment that their System 1 contains better quality patterns to draw on when System 2 becomes compromised. They have, through deliberate practice in low-stakes conditions, moved good reasoning patterns from System 2 into System 1. The quality of their automatic responses is higher because they have repeatedly practiced the deliberate version. Gary Klein's research on naturalistic decision-making, conducted over decades with firefighters, military commanders, intensive care nurses, and other expert practitioners, produced a finding that complicates the standard System 1 versus System 2 narrative in an important way. Expert practitioners under pressure do not run through analytical frameworks. They don't compare options systematically. They don't calculate expected utilities. They recognize a situation as belonging to a familiar category, and they know from that recognition what action the category calls for. Klein called this recognition-primed decision-making. The critical question is, when is this kind of expert intuition trustworthy, and when is it not? Klein and Kahneman eventually collaborated to answer this question, and their answer was precise. Intuition is trustworthy when two conditions are met. The environment must be regular enough that patterns exist to be recognized, and the decision-maker must have had sufficient experience in that environment with clear, timely feedback that allowed wrong patterns to be corrected. Both conditions must be present. Neither one alone is sufficient. A firefighter with 20 years of experience in structural fires has reliable intuition about structural fires. That same firefighter's intuition about chemical fires, or about financial decisions, or about interpersonal dynamics in a corporate setting, none of that inherits the reliability of the fire-specific pattern recognition. The expertise doesn't transfer. The feeling of expertise does. And that feeling, applied outside its legitimate domain, is not wisdom. It is pattern matching in the dark. This distinction gives you a practical diagnostic for your own intuitions. In what domains have you had extensive experience with clear, timely feedback, where you could observe the consequences of your judgments and update your patterns accordingly? In those domains, take your intuitions seriously, not uncritically, but seriously. They contain real information. In domains where your experience is limited, or where feedback has been slow, ambiguous, or systematically skewed, where you succeeded or failed without clearly knowing why, approach your intuitions with explicit skepticism, regardless of how strong they feel. The integration of both systems, used strategically, looks like this. Let System 1 do what it does. Generate fast impressions, flag anomalies, produce initial responses. Then treat those outputs not as conclusions, but as hypotheses. System 2's job is not to suppress System 1, but to examine its outputs, test them against available evidence, and either endorse them with genuine analysis or revise them when the analysis demands it. The practical obstacle is that System 2 examination requires a pause that the social and professional environments of most people's lives actively discourage. Immediate responses are rewarded. Visible deliberation is sometimes read as uncertainty or weakness. The pressure to respond quickly is real, but the response to that pressure, training yourself to pause without appearing to hesitate, to buy thinking time without telegraphing that you're doing so, is a learnable social and cognitive skill, not a personality trait you either have or don't. And the pause, consistently practiced, becomes shorter over time, because you are, repetition by repetition, moving the deliberate into the automatic. Building a System 1 that has internalized better quality patterns so that when the pressure arrives and System 2 is partially offline, what fires automatically is something you'd be proud of having chosen. That is not a guarantee, but it is the closest thing to one that this kind of work offers. Chapter 9. The 5 levels of why someone you know, maybe it's you, has solved the same problem 3 times. Different circumstances, different surface details, different people involved, but the same essential breakdown in the same essential place. The 3rd time it happens, there is usually a specific feeling attached to it. Not quite frustration, something heavier. The feeling of having done the work, fixed what was visible, and still ended up back here. As if the problem had a will of its own, a way of reconstituting itself beneath whatever solution you applied to its surface. That feeling is not a sign of personal failure. It is a sign of proximate versus distal causation, a distinction that, once you understand it with precision, changes fundamentally how you approach every problem you will encounter for the rest of your life. The proximate cause is the immediate visible mechanism of a failure. The distal cause is the upstream condition that made that mechanism possible, perhaps inevitable. Most problem-solving addresses the proximate cause. The fix feels real because something genuinely changed, but the distal cause remains intact, and from that intact distal cause, a new proximate mechanism eventually emerges. Sometimes identical to the one you fixed, sometimes wearing a different shape, but produced by the same underlying structure. Toyota's engineers formalized a practice for reaching distal causes in the mid-20th century that they called the 5 whys. The principle is simple enough to state in one sentence. When you encounter a problem, ask why it occurred, then ask why that cause occurred. Repeat until you reach a cause that is actionable and structural rather than symptomatic and incidental. In practice, the discipline required to actually follow this process, rather than stopping at the first satisfying explanation, is considerably more demanding than the principle suggests. The reason stopping is so tempting is psychological rather than logical. Each level of why produces an answer that feels complete. The answer at level 1 explains the event. It names a mechanism. It connects cause to effect in a way that is coherent and satisfying. The brain, which craves coherent narratives, experiences this as resolution. Moving to the next why requires overriding that sense of resolution, treating the answer not as an endpoint, but as a new question's starting point. This requires a specific cognitive commitment, the decision made in advance that the first answer is never the final answer. Donella Meadows, the systems theorist, identified something that the 5 whys practice reaches toward but doesn't fully articulate. In her framework of complex systems, there is a hierarchy of leverage points, places where an intervention produces change. At the bottom of the hierarchy are the numbers, the parameters, the flow rates, the specific quantities. These are easiest to change and produce the least durable effect. At higher levels are the feedback loops, the information flows, the goals of the system, the rules that govern it, and ultimately the paradigm, the shared set of assumptions and beliefs from which the system arises. Changing a number changes an output temporarily. Changing a paradigm changes everything the system produces, permanently. Most problem-solving happens at the level of numbers. The 5 whys, pursued honestly and far enough, tends to reveal that the real leverage is several levels higher, in the structure of feedback loops that nobody is monitoring, or in the unstated rules that govern behavior in ways nobody has made explicit, or in the foundational assumptions about what the system is, for that nobody has questioned because they predate everyone currently working within it. Here is the practical sequence. A customer satisfaction score drops. Level 1. Customers are complaining about response times. Plausible? Actionable. Most organizations stop here, hire more support staff, set faster response targets, monitor compliance. Level 2. Why are response times slow? The support team is handling tickets that require input from 3 different departments before they can be resolved. Level 3. Why does ticket resolution require 3-department coordination? Because the product was designed in functional silos without a defined owner for cross-functional issues. Level 4. Why was the product designed that way? Because the organizational structure rewards departmental metrics rather than customer outcomes, so departments optimize for their own performance measures rather than for coordination. Level 5. Why does the organizational structure work that way? Because leadership believes that clear departmental accountability requires siloed measurement, and nobody has explicitly examined whether that belief produces the outcomes it was intended to produce. The solution at Level 1 is more support staff. The solution at Level 5 is a reconceptualization of how accountability is defined and measured across the organization. The Level 1 solution costs money and produces temporary improvement. The Level 5 solution costs discomfort, the discomfort of examining a foundational assumption that powerful people have organized their authority around, and produces structural change. This pattern holds across domains with remarkable consistency. Personal patterns, examined through the same iterative questioning, reveal the same structure. The person who repeatedly finds themselves in relationships characterized by a specific dynamic, who has ended those relationships and started new ones without the pattern changing, is usually fixing at Level 1 or 2. Choosing different partners. Communicating differently in specific situations. The Level 5 question, which almost nobody asks until something forces them to, is, what belief about myself or about relationships makes this dynamic feel normal or inevitable to me? What am I not examining because examining it would require changing something I've built my self-understanding around? That question is not comfortable. It is also, in my experience, the only one that produces durable change at the level where the pattern actually lives. There is a failure mode in the 5 whys practice that deserves naming. The iterative questioning can, if pursued without rigor, produce a chain of causal attribution that terminates at a cause that is simultaneously foundational and completely outside your control. Every organizational problem tracing back to leadership doesn't understand the real issues. Every personal problem tracing back to my childhood produced these patterns. Every political problem tracing back to human nature is fundamentally self-interested. These may all be partially true. They are useless as endpoints because they explain everything and enable nothing. The test of a good root cause is not that it is deepest, but that it is both structural and actionable. It identifies a condition that is actually producing the problem through a mechanism you can trace, and it is a condition you have some realistic capacity to address. If your 5 whys chain reaches a terminal cause that you cannot influence, step back one level. The actionable cause at level 4 is more valuable than the inactionable truth at level 5. Meadows wrote something that has stayed with me since I first encountered it, that the most powerful thing any individual can do within a system is to see it clearly, not to immediately intervene, just to see it, the feedback loops, the delays, the unstated rules, the assumptions operating beneath behavior. Because a system that is clearly seen is a system that can be changed by people who understand what they're changing and why. A system that is not clearly seen will resist all interventions applied to its surface while continuing to produce, from its depths, exactly what it was structured to produce. The 5 whys is a tool for clear seeing, for stripping away the comfortable surface explanation and following the thread down to where the structural cause actually lives. The question is whether you're willing to follow it that far. Most people aren't, not because they lack intelligence or courage in general, but because what they find at the bottom of the thread is usually something that implicates them, their choices, their assumptions, their role in creating or sustaining the conditions that produce the problem. That implication is not a reason to stop asking. It is the reason the asking matters. Chapter 10. The problem with your problem definition. Before you read another word, consider the last significant problem you tried to solve, the one that consumed real time and real energy and produced either no resolution or a resolution that quietly generated a new problem in its place. Now ask a different question than the ones you asked at the time. Not how should I solve this, but was the problem I was trying to solve actually the problem? Not whether your solution was good, but whether the problem it addressed was real, accurately defined, correctly located, genuinely the thing that needed changing. This question is almost never asked, and its absence is responsible for more wasted effort, more failed initiatives, more persistent frustration than any deficiency in solution quality. We are, as a species, extraordinary solution generators. The failure point is almost always upstream, in the definition, the framing, the initial characterization of what is actually wrong and why. Daniel Kahneman's concept of WYSIATI, what you see is all there is, describes the mechanism precisely. The brain builds a coherent, confident interpretation from whatever information is available, without flagging that the available information might be radically incomplete. The result is a narrative that feels complete because it is internally consistent, even when it is missing the evidence that would change everything. The map feels like the territory because the brain has no mechanism for sensing the parts of the territory the map doesn't include. When something goes wrong, the information immediately available is the symptom, the visible, measurable manifestation of whatever underlying condition produced it. The symptom generates an immediate narrative. This is the problem. Here is roughly what caused it. That narrative is coherent, consistent with available evidence, and almost always wrong in the specific sense that matters most. It identifies the proximate rather than the structural cause, the surface rather than the source. Horst Rittel and Melvin Weber introduced a distinction that has become essential in systems thinking but hasn't migrated sufficiently into everyday problem solving. They distinguished between tame problems and wicked problems. Tame problems are well defined, have clear solution criteria, and can be addressed through expertise applied sequentially. Wicked problems are different in kind. They resist clear definition. Every attempt to define them reveals new aspects that complicate the definition. Solutions cannot be tested in advance. Each attempted solution changes the problem irreversibly. And crucially, the definition of a wicked problem and its solution are not separable. How you define it is already an intervention. The definition is not a precursor to the work. It is the first and most consequential act of the work itself. Most problems people encounter in organizations and personal life are closer to wicked than tame. The symptoms emerge from complex interactions between conditions that are each, individually, insufficient to produce the problem alone, and attempted solutions regularly produce new symptoms in an ongoing cycle that persists for years, because the flawed definition continues directing attention toward the wrong territory. The discipline of problem definition requires practices that are each demanding and collectively rare. Deliberate delay of solution generation, a period during which solutions are explicitly off the table, and cognitive effort is directed entirely at understanding what is actually wrong. Systematic stakeholder questioning, not to build consensus, but to collect genuinely different experiences of the problem, each carrying information invisible from other vantage points. Counter-definition, deliberately framing the problem in ways that contradict your initial definition, then asking what evidence would support each alternative framing. The hardest practice is willingness to abandon a definition that has already attracted investment. Once a problem has been officially named and resources allocated toward addressing it, the cost of redefining it is not just intellectual, it is social and political. Admitting the problem was misdefined implies that everything done in response was, in some measure, wasted. This implication is so costly that organizations and individuals will continue solving the wrong problem indefinitely rather than absorb the admission. And there is a personal version that deserves to be said plainly. The problems most of us carry longest are almost always misdefined in a specific, self-protective way, located entirely outside ourselves, in circumstances or other people we cannot control, which may be partially true. But a definition that places the problem entirely outside produces solutions that require other people or circumstances to change, solutions over which we have no direct leverage. The reframe that produces leverage asks, given this situation, including the parts I didn't choose and cannot change, what is the actual problem I have the capacity to address? That version exists in almost every situation. It is usually less dramatic than the external version. It is usually less comfortable. And it is usually the one that finally produces something different. Chapter 11. Testing Ideas Against Reality. There is a question Karl Popper considered the most important you could ask about any belief. What would have to happen for this to be wrong? Not what evidence would make it less likely. What would have to occur specifically for you to conclude that this belief does not accurately describe reality? If you cannot answer that question, if no imaginable observation could in principle contradict the belief, then the belief is not knowledge. It is something else, a preference, an identity marker, a story, but not a claim about how the world actually works that can be evaluated against how the world actually behaves. Run that question against the beliefs that most organize your life, about your own capabilities, about what you deserve, about how relationships work, and notice which ones can answer it and which ones cannot. The beliefs that cannot specify what would falsify them are also immune to updating. They will interpret every piece of incoming evidence as confirmation because they have no mechanism for receiving disconfirmation. They are unfalsifiable and therefore untestable by reality. Untestable beliefs are not harmless. They actively shape perception and decision-making, producing outcomes that continuously confirm them, not because they are true, but because they function as self-fulfilling frameworks that select which experiences become visible and which get filtered out. A person who believes they are fundamentally unlucky will remember misfortunes with clarity and allow successes to fade, continuously regenerating evidence for the belief regardless of what actually happens to them. Leon Festinger documented the mechanism when he infiltrated a doomsday cult that had predicted a precise date for a world-ending flood. When the date passed without incident, the group didn't disband. They emerged with renewed conviction, generating a new explanation that transformed the falsifying event into further confirmation. This is cognitive dissonance resolution in its most dramatic form. But the mechanism is not pathological. It is the normal functioning of a mind that has too much invested in a belief to afford losing it, which is exactly what makes it dangerous. The same process operates in ordinary people with ordinary beliefs, without any awareness that it is happening. The scientific method, stripped to its essential logic, is a set of commitments designed to make this reinterpretation harder to sustain. You state your hypothesis before collecting data, so you can't redefine what you were looking for after you see what you found. You specify measurement criteria in advance, so you can't shift goalposts when results arrive. You submit your work to people motivated to find flaws. The system builds in structural corrections for the bias toward confirmation that individual cognition cannot correct alone. You cannot replicate the full machinery of science in daily life, but you can adopt its underlying logic through two commitments that are individually simple and jointly powerful. First, before acting on a belief about what will happen, state explicitly what you expect and why. Second, after the outcome, compare what actually happened to what you predicted, and if there is a gap, examine it honestly rather than explaining it away. This sounds obvious. It is almost never done. Most people make predictions implicitly, acting from expectations without articulating them clearly enough to evaluate later. This implicit prediction cannot be falsified because it was never specific enough to be clearly wrong. Afterward, the outcome gets assimilated to whatever narrative the mind finds most consistent with existing beliefs. Success confirms the strategy. Failure confirms the external obstacles. The belief itself is never tested because it was never clearly enough stated to be testable. Making predictions explicit creates an accountability structure between your current thinking and your future experience. It forces specificity, which is itself valuable because vague beliefs are unfalsifiable by definition. And it generates over time a genuine empirical record of how accurate your mental models actually are, domain by domain. This record is often surprising. People discover systematic biases they weren't aware of, consistent overconfidence in certain areas, consistent underestimation in others. The experimental framing extends into how major decisions are designed. A decision treated as a commitment gets defended against contradicting evidence. A decision treated as an experiment, implemented with clear success criteria, a defined evaluation timeframe, and genuine openness to being wrong, creates a feedback loop that produces learning regardless of outcome. Someone running an experiment actively seeks disconfirmation because finding early signals of failure is more valuable than missing them until the cost is high. Popper thought the willingness to risk being wrong was not just a methodological virtue, but an ethical one. A person who holds beliefs in a falsifiable way is treating truth as something that matters more than the comfort of being right. Reality is an infinitely patient examiner. It will keep presenting the test until the answer changes. The question is how long you are willing to wait before you let it. Chapter 12. Seeing from where you don't stand. There is a specific kind of conversation that most people have had exactly once, if they're fortunate enough to have had it at all. A conversation in which someone described your situation back to you from a vantage point so different from your own that you could suddenly see it. Not see it better. See it differently. In a way that made your previous view feel not wrong exactly, but partial, like you'd been examining a sculpture from one angle and assumed that angle was the whole thing. The feeling afterward is difficult to describe, partly disorienting because something that felt complete now has visible edges, partly relieving because the thing that wasn't working makes sense now in a way it didn't before, and partly, if you're honest, a little embarrassing, because the other perspective was available the whole time, held by people whose experience of your situation you simply hadn't thought to ask about. Perspective taking is consistently underestimated as a cognitive skill because it is persistently confused with empathy. Empathy is the capacity to feel what another person feels. It is valuable and also insufficient for good decision-making, because empathy tells you how someone feels without telling you how they think, what they know, what information they have access to that you don't, or how the situation looks when organized around their priorities rather than yours. Perspective taking as a distinct cognitive skill is the ability to model another person's epistemic position, to reason about what they believe, what they know, what they are perceiving, and why. Research by Adam Galinsky and others has shown that perspective taking, not empathy, is the cognitive mechanism most strongly associated with improved negotiation outcomes, better leadership decisions, and reduced conflict. Empathy makes you feel connected. Perspective taking makes you understand how the situation actually looks from where someone else is standing, which is a different and often more useful kind of knowledge. Adam Grant's research adds a dimension most frameworks omit. Grant distinguishes between the support network, people who affirm and validate, and the challenge network, people who interrogate and push back. In terms of improving thinking quality, the challenge network is significantly more valuable, not because affirmation is worthless, but because the information most useful for improving a position is information that reveals its weaknesses, and that information is almost never held by people primarily motivated to support you. The challenge network is uncomfortable to build precisely because the discomfort is the mechanism. Someone who tells you what they genuinely think about your reasoning, rather than what they believe you want to hear, is giving you the gift of an honest external perspective. The instinct is to defend, to explain why they've misunderstood. These instincts are not always wrong. But before acting on them, the more useful move is to ask not, "Why are they wrong?" but "What would I need to believe for them to be right?" And to sit with that question longer than is comfortable, a practice that makes perspective taking more rigorous than the generic "consider their viewpoint" instruction, stakeholder role reversal. Rather than asking how this looks from their perspective, which produces a version filtered through your own assumptions, ask instead, "If I were this person with their history, their incentives, their information, what would I genuinely believe the problem to be? What would I be afraid of? What would I consider success?" The temporal version is equally powerful. Most decisions are evaluated from the present moment, the most emotionally proximate, and therefore one of the least reliable vantage points available. Asking how this decision looks from 10 years forward as a genuine cognitive exercise in which you model your future self's position as carefully as you can regularly produces assessments that differ significantly from the present tense evaluation. Future you has information present you doesn't. You cannot have that information now, but modeling the vantage point changes what questions you ask today. No single perspective is complete. Every vantage point reveals some features and obscures others by the simple geometry of where it stands. The sculpture is real. Your view of it is partial. The question is how much of the rest of it you're willing to walk around and look at, even when walking means moving away from the position where you've been comfortable standing. The people who think most clearly are not the ones who have found the right perspective and hold it firmly. They are the ones who have learned to move. Chapter 13. The Daily Practice. Building the habit, most people who decide to think more clearly do so in the same moment they decide to exercise more eat better, and finally read the books stacked on their nightstand. The intention is genuine, and within 2 weeks almost nothing has changed, not because the person lacked commitment, but because they treated a behavioral change as a decision rather than a design problem. They changed their mind about what they wanted without changing the structure of their day in ways that would make the new behavior happen automatically. And automatic is the only way anything happens consistently in a life that is already full. Peter Gollwitzer at New York University spent decades studying why good intentions so rarely produce consistent behavior. His central finding was deceptively simple. Intentions stated as goals, I want to think more carefully before making decisions, produce far less behavior change than intentions stated as implementation intentions. If this situation occurs, then I will do this specific thing. The if-then structure preloads the decision into memory in a way that links it to a specific situational trigger, so that when the trigger appears, the behavior fires automatically without requiring deliberate effort. This is not a trick, it is how habit formation actually works neurologically. A habit is a context-response link, a neural shortcut that routes a specific trigger directly to a specific behavior, bypassing the effortful deliberation that characterized the behavior when it was first being learned. Building a critical thinking habit is therefore not a matter of trying harder. It is a matter of designing the right if-then links and repeating them until they are stored. The practical implication: attach practices to behaviors that already happen reliably. If I make my coffee, then I spend 5 minutes identifying 3 assumptions I'm making about the day ahead. If I sit down after lunch, then I spend 2 minutes reviewing the most significant decision I made this morning. If I brush my teeth at night, then I name 1 moment today where my thinking was unclear and identify specifically why. You are not adding new slots to an already full day. You are inserting if-then links into the structure that already governs your behavior. The morning practice surfaces assumptions before they operate invisibly. 3 specific assumptions, named clearly about the day's highest-stakes interactions, take approximately 4 minutes and produce a qualitatively different quality of presence, not because the assumptions are necessarily wrong, but because named assumptions can be updated when evidence contradicts them, while unnamed ones cannot. The midday recalibration serves a neurologically distinct function. Decision fatigue accumulates through a demanding morning in ways not fully apparent to the person experiencing the degradation. You feel capable of careful thinking while performing thinking that is measurably less careful than your baseline. 2 minutes of genuine reflection on the morning's most significant decisions reactivates the deliberate system at the moment when automatic processing has most quietly taken over. It doesn't fully counteract fatigue. Nothing does except rest. But it interrupts the slide. The evening practice is where the most important learning happens, and it is the practice most people skip when the habit is under pressure, which is exactly backward. Experience without reflection does not produce learning. It produces the illusion of learning. The evening practice converts daily experience into accumulated wisdom through 3 honest questions. What did I believe this morning that turned out to be wrong or incomplete? What decision would I make differently, and what specifically was the flaw in my reasoning at the time? What do I now know about how my thinking works that I didn't know this morning? That third question is the most valuable and the hardest. It requires moving from the content of today's decisions to the process of today's thinking. Not just what went wrong, but how it went wrong. Not just what you missed, but why the missing happened. Over months, an honest evening practice produces a map of your specific cognitive signature, the characteristic patterns in how your reasoning tends to fail, which emotional states degrade your thinking most significantly, which domains produce systematic overconfidence. This is more useful than any general knowledge about cognitive bias because it is specific to you. The habit of clear thinking is not finally a matter of routines and journals, though those help. It is a matter of taking the quality of your thinking seriously enough to protect the conditions it requires. Treating careful reasoning not as something that happens in the margins of a full life, but as the activity that determines the quality of everything the full life contains. That reordering of priority is the habit underneath the habits. Conclusion. Everything in this audiobook reduces to a single practice, not a framework, not a system, not a morning routine. A practice of catching your own mind in the act, noticing the assumption before it hardens into belief, the belief before it hardens into identity, the identity before it hardens into the invisible wall that determines what you can see and what you cannot. Epictetus, who had nothing, no freedom, no property, no external security of any kind, built an entire philosophy on one observation. The only thing ever fully within your control is how you use your mind, not what happens to you, not what others think or do. How you receive experience, examine it, and choose to respond. That faculty, the one you've been training throughout this audiobook, is the only possession that cannot be taken. This doesn't end here. It begins here. With the next conversation you have, the next decision that arrives, the next moment you feel certain about something. That certainty is the invitation. Not to doubt everything, but to ask honestly, have I actually examined this, or does it simply feel true? The difference between those two things is the whole of what we've covered, and the answer consistently chosen is the whole of what changes. This is where most people stop, but this is exactly where your work begins. Knowledge means nothing without action. Discipline means everything when no one is watching. If you made it this far, you're already different. So like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment below with one action you're going to take after this. Make it real. Make it count. Now go and prove it to yourself. I'll see you in the next one.